This is
Make it plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure to be joined by someone who we've all gotten more and more acquainted with because of his numerous television appearances on MSNBC and elsewhere. He was the former director of Homeland Security for the District of Columbia, the intel chief for the District of Columbia. Most importantly, he's on the faculty at one of my alma maters, Georgetown University. We just had our So Hoya alumni weekend this past weekend. So Hoya Saxa to him. Dr. Donnell Harvin is with us. Hey, brother, how are you?
Good. And Hoya Saxa, back to you, my friend.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So I want to start to get your thoughts about this whole gun violence situation. Every day we're hearing about another mass shooting. And probably we'll hear about one quite possibly before this interview is over. Dr. Harvin, what do you think can be done and who should do it? Is this a law enforcement problem? Is it also a legislative problem? How much of it is a community problem?
So that's a great question, and it's a whole of government problem, and it's a whole of community problem. No, law enforcement can't do it all. By the time you call law enforcement, there's things that have already been set into motion that they have very little to no tools to deal with. And we know that, especially with the mentally ill calls, guys and gals with guns are your last resort, always. And so I think your opening was spot on. We average in the United States more than one mass shooting, and it all depends on what definition you look at. I believe the federal government Secret Service uses 4 more people shot, not necessarily 4 more people died, but 4 more people shot in one incident. We average more than one a day in the United States.
And it's truly a tragedy. What are your thoughts about the accessibility to all of these assault rifles?
Well, you mentioned astutely some of the issues, right? Be it mental health, be it gun control. If you look at other countries, New Zealand, Australia, who had horrific mass shootings, they were ready to act legislatively to restrict guns. The only difference from us and other developed countries in the West is the fact that we're awash in guns. By best accounts, and these are just estimates, 400 million guns, more than one gun for every man, woman, and child, with some to spare in this country. Now, what I mean by best accounts is because for many years, the gun lobby, particularly the NRA, has hamstrung the federal government, the ATF, for keeping computer records of gun ownership. They also, at the federal level, at the state level, they've also pushed for laws to not document and not have what we call databases for gun ownership. They've done so for reasons you'd have to ask them, but publicly, because they don't want the government tracking who has guns, because if they know you have guns, they can come and take it away. And it bakes into that whole really paranoia that the gun lobby is giving people, eventually the government will take your guns away and there will be a tyrannical state. And I don't want to opine on this, but I think it's so important. That's why red flag laws don't always work. Right? People always say on that side of the argument, enforce the laws that are already in the books. What they don't understand is that it doesn't matter. And they also point at our communities. They point at Chicago. They point at New York City. They point at Baltimore. Well, look at they have the strictest gun laws in the country, and they still have mass shootings and a lot of shootings. And they're absolutely right, but they're not using that. They're taking that out of context. It doesn't matter how strong a particular state or city's gun laws are. If you can drive an hour outside of that jurisdiction and buy a gun in a private sale or at a gun show and not have a background check. It doesn't matter what the red flag laws are in the state if you can buy a gun in one state and then move to another state and that state doesn't require you to register that gun. right? And so that's what we need. It's a comprehensive nationwide approach. And we see very little to no activity at the federal legislative level to do anything. And by and large, is because the gun lobby is the most powerful lobby in the Hill.
Well, let's talk about it in terms of our community, the Black community. And a term I loathe, which I'm sure you do as well, is the terminology of Black on Black crime. But what's different? Because actually, I think we should look at all of the gun violence as the same. But when it comes to guns within the inner city Black community, where do those guns come from? Are we still talking about people who are able to, as you alluded to, go outside the state and get those guns? Are the guns specifically being trafficked to young people within our own community?
So there's a lot of data on this that suggests that criminals who aren't allowed to get guns will get guns different ways. One, they'll purchase stolen guns, and those stolen guns often come from states that have lax gun controls, and they have a lot of guns, right? They'll break into people's cars, they'll break into homes, they will break into gun shops and steal guns and move them. From that standpoint, many of the guns are not legal. The problem is, and this is maybe a little controversial, but I'll say it. There is a death industry in this country, and we are the commodity. And what I mean by that is that there's a whole supply chain that is centered on people dying, from the purchasing of the guns through the prosecutorial and law enforcement, to trauma centers, to the true death industry, the medical examiner and the forensics and the funeral home industry. And the commodity is us, to be quite honest with you. And so when those on the pro-gun side talk about gun violence, they don't want to talk about the mass shootings that happen in areas that normal people wouldn't expect it. They don't want to talk about your kids sitting in their schools, enjoying the classroom time they have and not be feeling safe. They want to talk about the crime in the inner cities. And even that's a pejorative term, right? They want to talk about crime in these financially, economically oppressed communities. And I really don't see them having any, I want to choose my words wisely here, any incentive to make that change, make any change. We haven't seen it at all. And the only thing they've done is made on the back end these gun violence crimes or gun possession crimes, crimes that have a heavier weight, and I think most people wouldn't argue with that, but that feeds into the prison industrial complex.
Wow, and I hear you on that, and I'm glad you put that out there, and I appreciate you for saying so, because people need to get that. They need to understand that. I made an argument in 2012 after the Aurora Theater shooting, which I look back 10 years ago as one of the most covered mass shooting incidents of that time. That's when people really started changing. So wait a minute, and they began to realize for the first time, I think, that there weren't just killings randomly, so to speak, in the Black community. And I wrote an article, and the point I made was that the argument or the belief in so-called Black on Black violence left white folks vulnerable to things like Aurora. And I think my point was proven because we've seen mass shootings in the white community go up. So I ask you, if you think I'm right, if you're saying that there's a death industry when it comes to our community, I ask you, how can that not spill over into the white community to the point where they're left vulnerable, as they have been in all these other shootings in these schools, and now you have the brown community in Uvalde
Mhm.
If you say to one community, all right, well, y'all kill each other, that's fine, because that's what we want. Sooner or later, in the words of Malcolm X, don't all those chickens come home to roost in other communities?
Yeah, but I agree with you. I want to be careful about having the notion of gun violence that afflicts our community spilling over into other communities. And because that is the talking point out of context that the NRA uses, right? And that's why we have all these people in suburbia and in rural America arming themselves up, because they say, look at Chicago. Bro, you live 2,000 miles away from Chicago. Those brothers aren't going to get into a car and drive in the middle of nowhere to rob your house. But it's this fear of Black people and the guns that you're supplying to their communities, that you're allowing to get into their communities, that has this reciprocal, a reciprocity in terms of conspiracy and,
Gotcha.
and all these other things. So, and I've told people, like, I grew up in the South Bronx. I worked in Brooklyn, right? My history is, I became an EMT when I was 18 years old, right? I've been on mass shootings. I've been at mass stabbings. I've been shot at. I work in Brooklyn South, Brooklyn North, South Bronx. There are pockets of oppressed, drug-ridden areas in our communities that people who live in those communities know to kind of avoid, right? Like your mom would tell you, light goes out, you come in, right? Because that's when the shooting starts, right? So it's almost part of the DNA that you know how to navigate with that in the hopes that innocents don't get killed. What we've seen over the last probably decade is an increase, really over the last 2 years, I'll be honest with you, an increase in people we don't expect to get hurt by gun violence getting hurt. Kids playing outside, people minding their business, broad daylight, all those things that have been shocking for our neighborhoods.
No, point well taken. I agree with that point wholeheartedly.
But back to your point, I think that these non-traditional gun violence communities are so shocked and stunned that this can come to their neighborhoods, Parkland, Sandy Hook, Aurora. They still haven't grappled with that. And it's so random. Everyone says, well, that's not my neighborhood, until it's their neighborhood. And I've said this before, and this may make me sound fatalistic, but I almost think that gun violence at that level, nothing will change until that type of gun violence afflicts every community. And by the way we're going, it's gonna, right?
No, unfortunately, it seems that it will. And now something else is kind of new, and we've seen you talk about this. I'll ask you about it now. The Uvalde situation has brought about sort of a different angle on this, because now people are wanting to hold law enforcement accountable. We've not seen that in other mass shootings. Uvalde kind of stood up, and then you got video now, parents saying, y'all got to do something, y'all not doing nothing. And I'm sure law enforcement isn't very happy about that. But this is a kind of a new slant on this, isn't it? And I wonder if you think this might be the advent of a trend where people say, well, what is law enforcement really doing to combat these situations?
That's a great question. And Uvalde is a great case study because so many things went wrong. I mentioned this on air the other day. I think I described it as a hot buffet of ineptitude and missed opportunities. It's a perfect storm of what happens when government from top to bottom doesn't do their job to protect people, full stop. And so looking at the law enforcement, you're going to find in the investigation, there are some simple things that other communities do. And I did law enforcement, I did forensics for many years, such as interoperable communications. I maybe get a little wonky and technical, but just the fact that you don't share communication with all the responding law enforcement agencies, and there were dozens that came in, over 140 officers from I think 13 or 14 different departments, is a problem. And so I think that Parkland, I believe they held to account that police officer that didn't go in. People should expect more from their law enforcement. And so I find it interesting, but I also find it interesting that a lot of these communities, these pro-gun communities, as a juxtaposition, very back the blue and pro police, right? Blue Lives Matter, when it's convenient. And I'll leave it at that, right? When it's not convenient, like if you talk to any law enforcement officer and they say, you ask them simple question, would you rather go against an armed assailant that has a 9mm or AR-15? 100% of the time, you're going to say, I don't want to go against anyone that has an AR-15 because they don't issue us ballistic vests that can protect us from that, right? Not, only the SWAT guys have that, right? And they're not responding first. But you're okay letting your law enforcement that you back go against these 18-year-olds that are getting these guns. It doesn't make sense to me.
No, you're absolutely right. You were at DC Intelligence for the city on January 6th.
Correct.
You have been called to testify before this committee, so to speak, soon. You warned the federal government about what could potentially happen on January 6th, correct?
Absolutely.
Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, you know, it's well documented. I've actually testified. I've given testimony and been interviewed by the committee, the select committee, 3 times. Each time I emphasize the fact that we saw this wave of information coming that suggested that there was a large amount of people that were coming not to peacefully protest, but to storm the Capitol and take it by force. And we knew that because these individuals were sharing that information on the open web, chat rooms, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, all these plans were just unfolding right in front of everybody. So you didn't really need to be a well-trained intelligence analyst to see what was coming. The question is, why were those warnings ignored? And hopefully the January 6th committee will get to the bottom of that.
Lastly, obviously, we can all see ourselves. I mean, we don't need to do CSI to see the element of white supremacy that was at play January 6th, 2021. I mean, we saw the signs, we saw all of that. In these mass shootings, at least one of them, we haven't gotten all the information about all of them because they happen every day. We know there was a white supremacist element in the Buffalo top store shooting. When Obama first came into office, Homeland Security said a threat greater than outside terrorism threats is domestic terrorism, white supremacy. Do you still feel that that is the case, that we in this country are under greater threat from domestic white supremacy terrorism than that on the outside? And what role do you think that plays when it comes to these mass shootings cumulatively?
Over the last 3 decades, more people have been killed by domestic terrorists than transnational terrorists. I will tell you that it is, from my assessment, from my professional and personal assessment, that the rise of the radical, violent extremists on the right, particularly, is the #1 concern, and I will tell you why. Because they have melded forces. What we saw on January 6th was the maturation and basically the coming of age of the conspiracy theory movement. Now, we would talk about these folks in joking terms, 10, 15 years ago. These were the tinfoil hat folks, the individuals that say, aliens have beamed me up and the black helicopters are following me. Well, they've gone mainstream. They've manifested in the White House in the form of briefs and individuals. They're on mainstream media, on conservative media. What they didn't have until January 6th was an armed faction. And what we saw was that these conspiracy theorists were able to meld with anti-government groups, white supremacy groups, neo-Nazis, effectively giving us January 6th. But there's another group in there that's probably the most concerning, and we call them accelerationists. And I want to let your listeners understand this. They can look it up on their own. Accelerationists are, and I won't mention the groups that are part of that. Accelerationist is a form of radical violence that doesn't take a stand on the right or the left. They just want to stir the pot. Their ultimate goal is to start a race war. And so all throughout the summer of 2020, when we saw the George Floyd's and Black Lives Matter protests, we saw these individuals showing up armed at pro-police demonstrations. And then the same individuals show up the next day with BLM demonstrators showing Black folk and other folk, brown folk, hey, this is my gun. You know, you have a right to a gun. They just want to stir the pot. They want to create a race war. We've also saw the rise in 2020, and many people remember this, Black nationalists, armed Black militia coming to power. There's a number of groups that we saw. Some of them marched on Stone Mountain in Georgia. And that stunned the heck out of white America, to be quite honest with you. We're at a razor thin point that all you need is the increased militancy on both sides, not just the right, who really has the patent but doesn't own the patent for violence, but now on the left, who's seeing that, hey, these peaceful movements that I'm part of, they're not producing any change. So you're going to have an armed, violent faction from any peaceful movement. And I think you're starting to see that pick up. And I think that's going to manifest, unfortunately, in coming close to the 2022 election season and certainly 2024. And my advice was that we need to protect, particularly in the Black and brown community, we need to protect our vulnerable places and our crowded spaces. We need to protect our houses of worship. We need to protect our schools, because I believe the violence is coming.
This will definitely not be the last time we talk to our dear brother. His expertise is unparalleled. Dr. Donnell Harvin. Folks, follow him on Twitter at Donnell, DONELL_Harvin. Keep up with what he's saying. And you see him on television quite frequently. We're happy to have you here. And Dr. Harvin, if you don't mind, we'd love to keep you and your expertise close at hand, okay?
I'd love to come back. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you. Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. As always, perform an act of kindness on behalf of an elder or young person. Write a letter to a sister brother who just so happens to find her or himself incarcerated. Offer libations to the ancestors upon whose sturdy shoulders we all now stand. And above all, give thanks to the God of your understanding by whatever name you call her and him. All God asks of us is that we give each other love. Thanks for giving MIP love. And please remember to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.